Welcome everyone to this joint seminar by the Center for Research on Aging and the ESRC Center for Population Change, Connecting Generations. I'm Athena Vlahantoni. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this seminar. Our speaker today is Dr. Spela Mocnik, who is a research fellow here in the Center for Research on Aging and the Department of Gerontology, and she will take us through some of the findings from the project that she's been part of for nearly 3 years. So the talk is for about 35 minutes, and hopefully we'll have time for questions at the end. But if you have questions in the meantime, I think you can add them in the chat and we can pick them up later. So very warm welcome, Spela, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Athena, and thank you everyone for joining the seminar today. So I'm going to walk you through a project that used the photovoice method as one of the methods to explore financial planning for later life. And this is how I structured the presentation today. So first I'll start with a little bit of a project background, so what we aimed to do, who we worked with, and why this topic matters. And then the main part of the talk will focus on photovoice, so how we used it and the main findings from it. After that, I'll move into our design outputs, which formed quite a big part of our project as well. So what they were and why they matter in academic research. And then we'll have about like 15 minutes for the Q&A session. All right, so a bit of the project background. So this is the team that works on the project. It's a very multidisciplinary team. Athena is the PI of the project. Yuan is the co-investigator. We've also worked closely with a research fellow, Sadaf, who is here today as well. So she was instrumental in statistical analysis, and then I was responsible for the qualitative part of the project. So I think because it's such a multidisciplinary team, we really brought different strengths to the project, which really helped shape how the work evolved. So it's a 3-year project funded by the ESRC, and it brings together both academic and non-academic partners such as Southampton City Council, Department for Work and Pensions, Age UK, Pensions Policy Institute, and others. And the overall aim of the project is to better understand why pension protection and financial preparedness for later life differ across ethnic communities in the UK. And we're particularly interested in understanding how people from different backgrounds think about pensions, savings, financial security, and how these perspectives are shaped by different factors such as social, cultural, and structural factors. So we used a mixed method approach. So on one side, we have large-scale statistical analysis of national data sets. And on the other, we use qualitative and participatory methods such as the photovoice and focus groups. So to explore people's lived experiences and everyday decision-making around planning. So if the statistical analysis tells us that differences do exist with the qualitative part, we wanted to understand why these differences exist and where they come from. So a little bit of the study background. So pensions outcomes in the UK remain deeply unequal, and usually these inequalities tend to follow these familiar lines of, class, gender, ethnicity, and migration status. And over the past 2 decades, research has consistently shown that these intersecting factors influence financial security in later life. And within that, we know that ethnic minority groups are disproportionately affected by pension insecurity. So they're the ones who are more likely to experience interrupted work histories, informal or precarious employment, and just lower levels of pension participation overall. So one of the key structural issues is that the pension system is still largely built around the model of continuous and full-time employment. And this is something that simply doesn't reflect the realities of many people's working lives today. And we know that financial preparedness in later life isn't only about income and employment history. It's a very complex interplay of personal, cultural, structural factors. So things like attitudes towards saving or levels of financial literacy, trust is big. So trust in the institutions, or expectations around family support when getting older, things like that. And it's precisely this broader, more nuanced understanding that our project is trying to explore, and especially the qualitative methods, including the photovoice method. So a little bit about the photovoice. Before I go into findings, I'll just like to briefly explain the method that we use, so photovoice. It's a participatory visual method that uses photography as a form of storytelling and inquiry. So rather than having a conventional interviews one-on-one, we ask participants to take photos. So this allows participants to explore aspects of their lives that might be complex and sensitive or difficult to put into words. Which in our case, that definitely was the case, because we talked about topics like money, the future, so aging, pensions, things like that. So rather than positioning them as just research subjects, so we kind of like invited them through this method to become co-creators and storytellers. And what's powerful about this method is that it shifts the mode of expression from words only to images, which definitely opens up different kinds of insights and emotional connections, which will be quite clear from the next slide, where I'll show you the one of the quotes from our participants. But before that, just want to say that we recruited participants through a combination of project partners, community leaders, social media outreach, and we recruited 16 participants. We received 260 photos from them, and we conducted 15 interviews with them. So 2 participants were interviewed together because they wished, that was their wish. So here's the quotes that I was referring to. So the potential power of this approach, or of this method really came through sometimes in how the participants responded. And one of them here said that it really helped him think about the topic. So I'll just read it out. It'll take a while to tell you this, but I think it's worth saying. So like I say, I like going to the library to see if there's anything of interest happening, and I saw your leaflet and I thought, oh, that's interesting. And then I found it surprisingly deep and quite emotional. And some of the photos like almost took themselves when I had this sort of challenge in the back of my mind. And some I had to sort of not quite stage, but yeah, think about. But it's been a really, really valuable experience, actually. Yeah, so it's actually brought out, I mean, some things, it made me think about some things I need to reflect on, particularly about what is money for, that kind of huge question. But also it kind of brought out some things that I just assumed almost hadn't really thought about, you know. So yeah, this comment really reminded us that the method was not just a way of collecting data, but it was in itself a meaningful experience for the participants involved. Not everyone, of course, because not everyone was comfortable with taking photos, so there's that. And they declined participation because of the method as well, but it did work for quite a lot of people. So if you're dealing with, you know, sensitive topics like that, I think it's quite a useful and a very meaningful method. So yeah, this brings me to why we chose photovoice for this study. Primarily because of the nature of the topics that we explored. So like I said, financial security, aging, inequality, and these are very complex and deeply personal topics, and often very hidden experiences as well that are shaped by emotion, stigma often, and social context. So talking about money particularly can be very difficult because it's tied to pride, worry, and sometimes even shame. So rather than inviting participants to one-on-one interviews where they would have to talk about these deeply personal things with somebody that they don't know, we thought it would be good to give them an opportunity to reflect on these topics first through photography, through thinking through these topics, and then meeting us for an interview where we talked about the images and other things in more detail. So one of the strengths of this method is that it hands control to participants, which is very important when dealing with these topics. So they decided what matters or what they wanted to show and how to frame it. And it kind of like shifted power in a way in this research relationship, and allowed them to represent their realities on their own terms. Yeah, we were interested in understanding their everyday life through their own eyes. So not just what they say about their financial circumstances, but how they represent, so how they see and interpret the world around them. So a little bit more broadly. So this was the research process. It kind of like unfolded in 5 main stages. So first we started with recruitment, which was quite a long process and probably took over a year. And then once the participants joined, we held a photography workshop and information session. And after that, they went on to take the photographs, which usually took around 3 weeks, more for some, less for others. And then we met for the interview where we discussed the photos in more detail. And then we also had 2 design outputs from this method, so public exhibitions, and we developed a board game as well, which I'll talk about slightly later in the presentation. Here are some photographs from our recruitment efforts. So we connected with a lot of communities in Southampton and around Southampton, visited a lot of events, festivals. So yeah, like I said, it was quite a long process. And we built quite like strong ties with some of the communities here in Southampton. And then photography workshops and information sessions. So these were usually held either in person or online, depending on the preference of participants. So this is where we explain the purpose of the project, talk through ethical considerations around taking the photos in public spaces, for instance, and then also introduce some, excuse me, basic photography tips. And then at the end of the session, they were able to decide whether they want to use their own phones, which most of them preferred for taking pictures, or we gave them like small point and shoot cameras. All right, so a little bit about the participants. Like I've mentioned, we had 16 participants in this method, so 8 men and 8 women. Their ages ranged between 45 to 76 years, and they were predominantly white British participants, and then with a smaller representation from British Indian, Chinese, Bangladeshi, and other white. They had varied educational backgrounds, so ranging from secondary school to postgraduate degrees. And then in terms of employment status, there was a good mix of full-time and part-time workers, those who were retired, and those currently not working. So in terms of ethnic backgrounds, maybe it wasn't, the group wasn't as diverse as we had hoped, but there was still quite a lot of diversity within the group in terms of their, life experiences, education, employment, and things like that. So, yeah. So like I mentioned earlier, we invited them to take photographs in response to these 3 guiding themes. So we thought that financial security or planning is quite an abstract theme. So we provided some guidance, but these were not very restrictive categories, more like prompts to help them reflect on different aspects of their financial lives. So the first theme was money matters. So here we asked participants to capture anything that represented their relationship with money. So daily expenditures, pressures, decisions, practices that shape how they manage their day-to-day finances. So anything to do with money. Then the second theme was COVID cost and changes. So this prompt was supposed to encourage them to think about how recent events affected them both financially and emotionally. And by recent events here, we meant so the pandemic, the cost of living crisis, any employment changes if they had occurred because of these events. So here we wanted to understand how kind of like broader structural disruption translated into their everyday experiences. And then the third theme was contemplating later life. So here we invited them to reflect on aging, aspirations, fear, expectations around retirement, around later life. And the idea was not to ask them directly about pensions only, but to kind of like surface feelings and stories, all the stories that are connected to growing older and preparing for the future, also financially. So across all these three themes, we emphasized that they had full control over what they wanted to share, what they wanted to photograph, and how they wanted to frame their experiences. Yeah. So I mentioned before that we received 260 photographs, and here I wanted to give you a brief overview of the kind of pictures that we received. So these are just a few examples. So in the first group, so under the first theme, so here the photos were about attitudes to money and spending. So these images really reflected their personal relationship with money, which was often shaped by upbringing, culture, and their life experiences. Some participants associated money with fear or restraint, so which was often rooted in childhood hardship. So they talked about that through photos as well. And then others, for example, showed strategies for keeping things in check. So a lot of like material realities emerged in these photos, but also interestingly, a lot of emotion and memory as well, which is maybe something that we didn't expect. Then the second group of photos focused on the structural factors, like I mentioned. So they spoke about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, sometimes job loss, or working beyond the retirement age because of the pandemic, especially those who were in the NHS, or early retirement in some cases as well. So that was a topic as well. And the cost of living crisis, that was a major one that really came through the photos. And it wasn't just abstract, but it was shown through, empty fridges or increased energy bills, savings accounts that were empty because they were simply unable to save anymore. So the images really showed how these external forces shape people's ability to plan or save, or inability. And then the third group of photos was about contemplating later life. So anything from financial planning to aspirations to anxieties as well. So there was quite a stark contrast between photos. Some of them were very hopeful, like traveling, walking trails, places that were associated with peace and freedom. And then there were other photos that expressed a lot of uncertainty. For example, not knowing if they could ever afford to stop working. So there was quite a big tension between like dreaming and doubts. And the photos really made they made visible something that is usually invisible, and that's the emotional side of financial planning. So now I'll turn to findings a bit more analytically. So here we analyze both the photos and the interviews, and four main groups of factors that influence financial planning for later life emerged. And I'll go through each of them briefly. So first, we found that childhood hardship and social class, or like early life experiences, can have lasting effects in how people relate to money or saving and planning, things like that. So participants who grew up in financially constrained households often developed frugal habits, but at the same time, they also carried with them a deep sense of financial insecurity, which could then in turn either motivate them to save or limit their confidence in long-term planning. So here I have one of the quotes to kind of like illustrate that. So this participant said, this is an existential question really about, about what money is and what it's for. And I think I'm a bit of a hoarder with money, and I think that comes from insecurity in my childhood. And I think it's a combination of two. It's an insecurity in my childhood, which I think has probably led to the anxiety. And then the anxiety feeds into that. I've got to keep this money in case something dreadful happens. So yeah, I've got a lot of stories like that. Then when it came to access to financial knowledge and guidance, the picture was quite mixed. So there were some participants who had received support through, for example, free advisory services at their workplaces, or through recommendations from their friends or family. So we saw that social capital played quite a big role in how people accessed financial knowledge and guidance. And then on the other hand, there were those who faced, for example, language barriers or digital access barriers and were excluded from, or didn't have friends or family who would have this kind of knowledge. And they were excluded from this vital information. And here's one of the quotes that exemplifies that. So it's multiple reasons why accessing information might prove difficult. One is the cultural reason. So we were taught to be self-sufficient, to not rely on other people. Secondly, language barrier. If they want to apply, they need to understand English. Even if they know English, they do not know where to apply now that everything is online. You need to go online on a computer. First, you need to have a computer. You need a Wi-Fi. So some of the elderly people, they do not have a computer. So yeah, language and digital barriers still exist. Then the cost of living crisis was a dominant theme, definitely. So many participants were simply unable to prioritize any kind of retirement planning or long-term financial planning when they were faced with immediate economic pressures. So short-term survival definitely took precedence over any kind of long-term financial vision. And here's one of the quotes. So I keep trying to save. So obviously I do save here and there, and I try not to, so we don't like splash out on expensive holidays and expensive clothes and things like that. So I try to buy in the sale, and I try to, try and keep within my means and things. But with having a mortgage as well, it's tough at the moment. So at the moment, I'm not in paid employment. I'm just on universal credit. So trying to pay my mortgage and bills and pay for the additional expenses can be quite a struggle. Yeah. And then finally, participants expressed, a lot of participants expressed difficulty in imagining retirement at all. So definitely those who had unstable work histories or migration journeys, for them the idea of planning decades ahead felt very abstract and sometimes completely out of reach. And this was exacerbated by the cost of living crisis as well. And then psychological barriers were also one of the factors for sure. So fear, uncertainty, sense of no control. And here I have a quote from one of the participants who does plan for the future, does have financial knowledge, but still finds it a bit daunting to think about her pension and savings and things like that. So the psychological barriers here are quite prominent. So she said, so I probably need to spend a bit more time looking at my pension. What does it look like? I feel like I've ignored it a bit. They actually have seminars, but I've missed two because I was away. But there's another one, you can kind of contact them and you've got an app that you can look at and things. So I just need to sit down and not be scared of it. I think because I'm worried that it's not going to be very much, and I don't necessarily want that reality of like, oh, actually, that's not, yes. So yeah, here we see that a person who knows where to find the information, is planning for her future, but still is kind of scared at looking at her finances. So to recap, a few of the new or underexplored insights that we found through this method in this study. I think one of the most striking insights from this study was the powerful role of financial education. I think it surprised us all a little bit. So both informal and formal financial education. So many participants trace their attitudes towards saving, planning, money back to what they had or hadn't learned from parents or early jobs or early life experiences. And across all ethnic backgrounds and across all backgrounds really, there was a shared belief that early and lifelong financial education was essential, so both formal and informal. And this came through in this method and also in the focus group discussions as well. So people repeatedly said things like, oh, I wish I'd learned that in school, or, you know, no one told me about this, I didn't know about this. So this message was really one of the most consistent ones. Then another insight was that participants who had access to advice and financial information, either through their friends or family or workplace, were more confident and proactive about retirement planning. And then on the other hand, we saw that fear, uncertainty, and having sense of no control, things like that, created a psychological barrier to planning ahead. So with some participants even avoiding to think about later life entirely. And then, of course, the cost of living crisis emerged as a major structural factor. So people focused on immediate survival, and that made kind of like the long-term planning quite unrealistic or irrelevant at the moment. So, yeah. And now I'm turning to the design outputs, which were a really exciting part of our study and quite a big part of our study as well. So one of the aims of our project was to extend participation beyond just the research participants themselves and open it up to the wider publics. And the design outputs, which were public exhibitions and the board game, became kind of like new ways for people outside the research participants to engage with the studies theme of aging, financial resilience, inequality. So these design outputs weren't just kind of like presentations of data or our findings, but we wanted to create spaces for kind of like a shared reflection around these topics that should interest everyone. So we also wanted to translate findings into accessible and experiential forms. So the exhibitions and the board games made these kind of like abstract ideas very tangible, and they allowed people to see and feel the lived realities behind the research and behind the data. And a big part of this was fostering dialogue and kind of like intergenerational learning. So we engaged younger audiences as well, particularly year 11 students from a local school here in Southampton. And we hopefully sparked conversations around financial planning and responsibility across generations that might not happen otherwise. And then finally, this was also an opportunity to kind of like experiment with the design-led research as a form of social impact. So design here in this context wasn't just a tool to present the data, but it became a tool for kind of like a civic engagement. So facilitating dialogue and learning. So we kind of like repositioned the role of the researcher and the designer from kind of like an expert to a facilitator, hopefully, and co-created spaces for reflection and change. So the public exhibitions were a really special part of this project. So they were co-curated and designed in collaboration with the postgraduate students from the Winchester School of Art. So they worked closely with us to translate the research findings, so the participants' photographs and narratives, into an engaging public format. And the exhibitions brought together quite a diverse audience, so participants and their families, local community members, general public, policymakers, and of course academics and researchers. So it really became a space where different perspectives could meet and interact, which doesn't often happen. And many attendees describe this experience of attending these public exhibitions as emotionally powerful. So the stories and images really resonated with people. and prompted them to reflect on the topics that we dealt with in our study. So our hope was that we could convey these very complex social issues in a way that felt a little bit more accessible and human and emotionally engaging, rather than purely academic or very abstract and statistical. And just a little bit about the exhibition curation. So photography exhibitions are usually quite a standard part of the photovoice method. But in this study, we kind of like envisioned them more like design interventions. So we tried to translate, of course, the findings, but also kind of like integrate some design principles such as like spatial storytelling, audience engagement, and aesthetic framings into the research process itself. So here, I think is where our exhibitions differ slightly. And how the curation itself became kind of like a critical and reflexive medium to amplify, participants' voices, and then beyond the research setting. So we had 2 public exhibitions. The first one was at the Winchester Gallery last year, and then the other one at God's House Tower here in Southampton. So moving on to the second design output, which was the board game. So it is an educational board game that focuses on financial resilience and decision making. So we used a prototype of a board game with over 600 pupils aged 15 to 16 years old. And these workshops took place in a school that's both ethnically and socioeconomically quite diverse, so which made for really interesting and rich and varied discussions. So through the game, the pupils explored themes such as budgeting or saving, spending priorities, planning for the future, pensions as well, but in a way that is very accessible and playful, collaborative, and also grounded in real life scenarios. And what was interesting was how the game environment created space for open conversations about these topics, which can always feel a little bit awkward or intimidating. And pupils shared their perspectives. They negotiated choices within their groups when they were playing the game, what financial planning or independence might look like for them. So while it was an educational activity, it was also a form of dialogue and reflection, which was really interesting. And we held focus group discussions with both the teachers at the school and the pupils who played the game, and got quite good feedback, and we'll use that to improve the game further. Here you can see a few moments from the design process, which we carried out in collaboration with postgraduate student at the Winchester School of Art again. So the challenge here was really to translate the research findings from our study into something interactive and engaging for a younger audience. Excuse me. So we worked through several stages of prototyping, playtesting. We experimented with different game mechanics, colors. So visual language was very important, the tone, because we wanted to make the game very approachable and inclusive, rather than, intimidating and too didactic. So yeah, it was a really nice, a very nice creative and analytical process at the same time. So here's a picture from one of our school visits in May this year, and the board game. Like I said, we got feedback, so we'll try to further improve it. And we're also preparing something for an even younger audience for primary school. And here's an image from our exhibition at the London Design Festival in September this year. So we presented the board game there as well, alongside with the story of how we developed it, which you can see on the posters behind. And now just a few words on why these design outputs matter in academic research. So ultimately, these design outputs became a way of extending our research into the world. So translating participants' lived experiences into public conversations that might not have happened otherwise. So we shifted the findings from representation to engagement. So moved from simply showing what we learned to actually creating spaces, hopefully, where others could interact with these insights and question them and reflect on them. And the design here really functioned as a vehicle for social impact. So hopefully the creative translation of our research will help foster financial literacy or spark conversations and dialogue, intergenerational dialogue, and also bring new publics, new groups of people into the conversations around aging and financial resilience. And like I mentioned before, we repositioned the role of the designer and the researcher. So not just mere observers, but kind of like facilitators of this shared inquiry and civic engagement. So for us, the value of the design has been really not just in communicating research, but in kind of like transforming how our research or our findings and insights can live and act beyond the academic sphere, which I think is really important. So yeah, and with this, I'll conclude my presentation and we can have a discussion if there are any questions or comments.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Spela, for the presentation.